So this poem is called In a Station of the Metro, and it's by Ezra. So first I'm gonna read it. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bow. So we'll start with the title. So in a station of the metro, basically it serves as giving a location and contextualizes the poem so that the reader can picture it better. So also in Paris, a metro is short. It's a subway system in Paris. It's short for metropolitan. So throughout the poem, this will help visualize the poem in your brain. So the word apparition, it's known as like a ghostly figure, but it has two important parts to it. One is that it's a very bland face. There's not a lot of emotion involved in the face, and the second thing, and the more important thing, is that it's coming and going. So the face, the ghostly figure, is not there for a long time. It quickly comes and goes. So in this example, the apparition of these faces in the crowd. Basically, it's talking about the faces that are passing the speaker of this poem. They're very bland faces with no emotion, and they keep coming and going, which from the title we can determine is in a subway station in Paris. So then the second part of this first line of these faces in the crowd. So again, this helps paint a picture in your head. So if you can imagine as if you're the reader or you're the speaker. And here I circled the colon. What Ezra Pound does a lot, especially with his short poems, is he utilizes the punctuation to use less words. So right here, to transition to the next line, he could have used some sort of conjunction, but instead he just put a colon there, and it gives the same message just with fewer words. And then here, petals on a wet black bow. So first off, a bow is a tree branch, and normally in poetry there are some words that have positive or negative or just in general connotations that people commonly know. So the words here, wet, black, bow, those all have very negative connotations in poetry. But the word petals, as you can guess, has a very positive connotation. So after the first line, when he uses the colon, he's basically starting the next line, which is the beginning of the comparison to the apparition of these faces in the crowd, or between that line and the second line. So petals on a wet black bow. He's basically saying the petals as in these good, positive things, like petals on an actual flower or tree, on a wet black bow. So one thing about Ezra Pound, he would write in a very Chinese influenced way when he talked about imagery and nature. And a common tree that has significance in China is a Japanese cherry blossom, which is known for having many, many petals on their tree branches. So this was one example of him talking about that. He says petals on a wet black bow, and if you know what a Japanese cherry blossom tree looks like, the petals are very bright and pink and very nice to look at. So he uses this comparison of petals on a wet black bow as in something positive on a very negative topic to compare the apparition of these faces in the crowd. These faces being the positive things, the people in a very negative place, or not necessarily negative, but very uninteresting place, the subway station. So that's it for the actual poem. Now I'm gonna talk about analysis. So as you can tell, the poem's very short. It's just 2 lines. One of the reasons for this was that Ezra Pound was really influenced by haikus, So you can see that in this poem and a lot of other poems. He'll commonly talk about nature, which is what haikus normally were about, and he writes in this very minimal style. He doesn't use a lot of words to convey a very powerful message. So, Ezra Pound was basically known for creating and utilizing the term imagism, and that was his main contribution to the Lost Generation, which is in my slideshow. He used imagism, which was a movement in the early 20th century, which is common in Anglo-American poetry, and it favored the precision of imagery and clear, sharp language. So, in this poem, some of the strategies I noticed was that he said a lot with not a lot of words. So, as you can see, there's only 2 lines in the poem, but he's able to convey a very impactful message with just these 2 lines. He also uses descriptive language, so like the apparition of these faces in the crowd, that definitely paints a picture in your brain. But more importantly, the second line, where he used a lot of descriptive language. He says, petals on a wet black bow, which can definitely paint a picture in your head. And it also shows, it easily shows a contrast between the petals and the wet black bow. And then the last strategy I noticed was imagism, which I talked about earlier, but basically just using imagery to help the reader understand what's going on. For the meaning, for literal meaning, basically just what I talked about, the simple faces of the civilians in the metro passing each other, and then he compares that to the colorful petals on the tree branch, which is not so colorful and very plain. So for the metaphorical meaning, this is really where it's what the poem's known for, because besides this, it's somewhat of a simple poem, but when you really think about what it means, it's pretty interesting. So for the metaphorical meaning, I basically touched on how the civilians at the metro, so they're at the metro not to go to the metro, right? People that are there to go other places. They're using the metro as a transportation place, right? So nobody actually wants to go to the metro. So when that happens, you see all these people there not really interested in interacting with anyone or doing anything other than just going there, getting their transportation to where they need to go, and minding their own business. And the petals in the second line represents all the people with all their unique stories and where they're going in a very non-interesting place, a very boring place, which is the metro. And some of the themes I noticed was brevity. He definitely is able to convey a lot, which I talked about earlier. He's definitely able to convey a lot with a little. And then I also noticed that he talks about the modern world versus the natural world, which is common with a lot of his poems, not just this. He often talks about nature, and occasionally touches on the modern world. So like here, he talks about, in the first line, it's about the modern world, right? The apparition of these faces in the crowd. That's something in a more social manner, right? You're in public, you're seeing people. But then he talks about the natural world in the second line, where he says, petals on a wet black bow, which is very nature-oriented, not very people-oriented, right? And he uses both of these lines, and he compares them in a very meaningful way. So that was my analysis for this poem, In a Station of the Metro by Ezra Pound.